Okay, so welcome to U.S. Diplomacy in the Afghanistan Evacuation. I'm Sheila Budoff with Arlington County's 55 Plus program. This program is being recorded and will be posted at a later time on the Arlington County 55 Plus YouTube channel. Our speaker will be spotlighted so that he will be the only one that appears in the recording. And now it is indeed an honor for me to introduce our very, very special guest speaker for today, George Sibley. Mr. Sibley is a retired senior Foreign Service officer with an extensive and distinguished career in the State Department. His most recent posts were Deputy Chief of Mission and then Chargé d'Affaires at the U.S. Embassy in Rangoon, Myanmar, formerly known as Burma. He then served as a diplomat in residence jointly for Duke University and the University of North Carolina from 2021 to 2022. While in that position, the State Department called him back for a very special mission to run the Afghanistan Task Force night shift during the evacuation from Afghanistan in August to September 2021. In that position, George worked from 7 p.m. to 9 a.m. for 17 days straight. Not an easy task, and he will share his experience coordinating diplomatic efforts to relocate tens of thousands of people to safety in partner countries. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Mr. Sibley, and please hold your questions to the end. We will leave some time for that as well. You're welcome to enter your questions in the chat as we go, but we will hold them until the end. So thank you.
So thank you very much, Sheila, and I appreciate the invitation to speak to you. And again, I do apologize for the mix-up on the time, but I'm glad to be here with you. I'm going to talk a little bit about sort of how we got where we are, but mostly I'm going to just talk about my own experience with this evacuation. I sent out some pieces for you to read, which if you didn't read it, that's fine. There was a lot of reading there, but basically some that were very critical. In fact, one that was absolutely scathing about the event, and others that were more measured. The one that probably most applies would be the one that the State Department put out, which was sort of an after-action report, which was trying to identify, what went wrong, why it went wrong, what went right, why it went right. And so I definitely would encourage that one. I'll talk a little bit quickly about sort of my history with Afghanistan. Now, I never served in Afghanistan as my post. I did serve in Iraq at one time, but I did manage to visit Afghanistan in the 1990s. And at that time, the Taliban, the first time around, were making significant gains within Afghanistan. And I traveled with the Assistant Secretary of State, Robin Rafel, and we actually took a drive from Peshawar in Pakistan through the Khyber Pass to Jalalabad, where there was a local, if you recall, after the war with Russia, in which we assisted the Afghan Mujahideen to ultimately expel the Russians or induce the Russians to leave, there was a long period of sort of warlordism. There was not a really strong central government, really a government at all. And so different areas of Afghanistan were sort of governed independently by these warlords. So the local warlord in Jalalabad was a guy named Haji Qadir. And so we were hosted there by Haji Qadir and his brother Abdul Haq. And it was extremely interesting to go in and see, first of all, driving in, seeing the destroyed and rusted Russian tanks by the side of the road. And then in Jalalabad, several things. One is we visited a hospital where we saw all these young kids with one leg because the mining of Afghanistan had been so horrific and so much of it had not been cleared that there were a lot of, guys go out, play soccer, and boom, now they have one leg. So that was very sad and very telling as sort of the remnants of that part of the war. And then the other thing we visited was a university. And they were extremely proud. They were showing us that there was, in this university, there were co-ed classes, university classes. And so we went in to see one, and sure enough, there were. However, there were men on one side of the classroom, students, and women on the other side of the classroom, and there was a big, complete, impenetrable barrier between the two. So the professor could see both, but they couldn't see each other. So that was how they had allowed this co-educational classroom without allowing any mingling of the two sexes. So that was also very interesting. So this is, I give this as some background that, well, I am by no means an Afghanistan expert. And then if you have, detailed questions about the history or politics of Afghanistan, I'm probably not going to be able to answer authoritatively, but I have actually visited there. And the interesting denouement was, by the way, I should point out that at that time, the question had arisen whether we should recognize the Taliban. And while we certainly had concerns about their ideology at that time, it was something that at least we thought about, just because the period of warlordism had been very damaging to Afghanistan and the Afghan people, and the thought that perhaps having a central government that would be able to bring peace and stability and some mild measure of prosperity might be a good thing. We ultimately did not do that because of the human rights concerns and other reasons, but it was something that we at least thought about. And a few countries did recognize the Taliban. But as time passed, the trigger that ultimately led to our involvement in war there was 9/11. And the fact that the planners and organizers of the attack on our homeland that killed 3,000 people and destroyed the World Trade Center and damaged severely the Pentagon were based in Afghanistan, and the Taliban were not willing to turn them over to us, and so we went to war against Afghanistan directly in response to that attack in the United States. I will contrast that with our action in Iraq, in which there did not seem to be a direct connection or a direct link to any attacks in the United States, although some had tried to make some kind of a link, but that was never really established. So it's quite a different decision that we made in Afghanistan, where there was definitely the source of the attacks against us was inside that country, as opposed to in Iraq. Haji Qadir, ultimately, after the war, he and his brother were helping us against the Taliban. Haji Qadir's brother, Abdul Haq, was caught behind Taliban lines, was executed, probably tortured first. And then Haji Qadir became a vice president in the government of Afghanistan, and he was assassinated during the time when he was vice president. So both of those people that we visited in the early 90s ultimately both gave their lives in support of a new dispensation in Afghanistan. So that was a little bit about my connection to Afghanistan, a little bit about the source of our presence in Afghanistan. The war we pursued was very successful. I mean, we won that war very quickly, very effectively, routed the Taliban, but we didn't capture Osama bin Laden, who was the person and the Al-Qaeda organization that had been the ones who attacked us. They were able to escape and hide in the hinterlands of Afghanistan and Pakistan. And so, in a sense, our mission was not done until almost exactly 10 years later. And it's very interesting when you look at the timing. 9/11 took place on, September 11th, 2001. Most of us remember that day vividly and will as long as we live. And then bin Laden was killed in 2011, on May 2nd. So almost exactly 10 years later. And then we left Afghanistan almost 10 years after that. we left Afghanistan in 2021, the last flight taking off at the very end of August, when we finally completed our evacuation. So you could see, sort of 2 decades, and I would argue, I mean, something to think about, sort of looking back. Why did we stay for the second decade? The first decade, you can say we had that unfinished business with Al-Qaeda and Osama bin Laden. But after we had achieved that goal, why did it take an additional 10 years for us to leave? And I'm thinking, there are many answers for that. But some of the criticism that is probably founded in terms of our departure was, well, if our mission had changed, had we accomplished that mission? And certainly along the way, we had made significant efforts to try to develop civil society, to try to develop a culture of democracy, to try to develop a capable military, a very, very significant effort to try to improve gender equality and to allow women to have a place within Afghan society, a constructive place. And so all of those things we were to some extent successful at, but not ultimately successful, because when the Taliban regrouped and became stronger, eventually all of that crumbled away. And so you can look at that through 2 lenses. One lens is, well, obviously we didn't stay long enough. We should have stuck with that job because we didn't succeed in accomplishing it. That's a valid critique, absolutely. The other side of that coin, and one that President Biden has used, is that, look, if we couldn't accomplish that after 20 years and billions of dollars of investment in all of these efforts, if the Afghan people were not able to sustain it themselves, when would they have ever been able to? And certainly that's a valid question. So you can sit on either side of that and have a debate, but the reality is President Trump made the decision we would leave, negotiated the Doha Accords, and had committed to pulling out all U.S. troops by May of 2021. And in the meantime, several things had happened. And one of the things that had happened was that he was reducing our troop levels significantly. But he had also really shut down the processing and the infrastructure of special immigrant visas. And these are the visas that are allowing Afghans who have worked directly with us, I should really be clear here, not civil society. Maybe we put money into a civil society organization doing opportunities for women to do education or whatever. Those people that we might have supported that institution, but the special immigrant visa really is for people who work directly with us in a way that was valuable, were allowed to be brought to the United States. But the processing of those special immigrant visas, and there were like 18,000 of them in the backlog, had really slowed and almost stopped under President Trump. And so when President Biden came in addition to affirming that we would still adhere to the withdrawal, and I should point out an important part of that agreement was that the Taliban would not attack us based on our commitment to leave. So reneging on that agreement would undoubtedly have invited military attacks against the United States. Undoubtedly. Most likely, let's say. And so there was an additional reason to adhere to that, aside from, I think, President Biden's stated belief that this was a forever war and 20 years was too long already, but also the fact that that agreement had included that protection for our troops and our people on the ground. So as we started to ramp up the special immigrant visa process, I was a diplomat in residence in North Carolina, And I got a call in August. And of course, I've been following peripherally what was happening in Afghanistan and realized that the Taliban were making significant gains. But also reading, there were 300,000 Afghan troops and 80,000 Taliban, and the Afghan troops had been trained and supplied by the United States. So as I think almost any observer believed that perhaps the Taliban ultimately would overthrow the government. That was not necessarily a surprise, but that this would be a matter of months or probably even years before they would achieve the strength to have that tipping point to overthrow the government. And so the sense of great urgency was there in the sense of our preparations for withdrawal, but not in terms of anticipating the sudden massive fall of the government that actually took place. And I should point out, there are a lot of people in hindsight who were really geniuses and say, oh, we knew all along that would happen. In hindsight, it's very easy to know what will happen. But there were very few people in advance of that event who really would have anticipated the rapid fall and takeover of Kabul by the Taliban. So the call I got was not to be involved necessarily in the evacuation, but it was something a little different. They said, look, George, we're ramping up this operation to start moving these SIVs much more quickly through the pipeline. And the problem that we're having is that we need the cooperation of ambassadors around the world, U.S. ambassadors, to assist in the processing and the moving of these people. But our team working on this SIV program has very senior leadership working on that, and a lot of junior people doing the processing. And if someone who's very junior calls up an ambassador, they're going to say, well, talk to my political counselor, I'm too busy, right? So we need someone who is senior, who can pick up the phone and call an ambassador and have the ambassador say, oh, okay, well, what's the problem here? And explain, we really need that help and that cooperation. So I went to Washington on, let's see, it was Saturday, the 14th of August, planning to work on the SIV process. I'd been called earlier that week, and I'd taken a few days to do the paperwork to, first of all, get permission to leave my existing job for a period of time and to get approval to go to Washington. And I went and I checked into a hotel about a mile away. And my wife stayed behind, and I walked over to the State Department. And at this point, Kabul was falling. And in fact, Kabul fell. And so I went into the State Department, and they said, George, I know you were supposed to come and work on this SIV problem, but we now have an emergency, and we need to work on this evacuation. The staff from the embassy had moved to the airport and had evacuated the embassy already, and we need to start in a very short timeline evacuating as many people as we can. We need your help. And so I said, of course. I mean, what do you need me to do? Name it. And so in very short order, I became the director of the night shift of the task force in the operations center that was charged with carrying out the evacuation from Afghanistan. And so that became, as Sheila had mentioned, for the next 17 days, I would go into the State Department at about 7 p.m., a little before 7 p.m., and I would leave the next morning after the morning meeting, doing the turnover, explaining what had happened during the night, and I would go back to my hotel, around 9 in the morning. And so, and this was every day because it was an emergency. So of course it was every day. So the routine eventually settled in, but it was very, very difficult at first. If you recall, those early days of the evacuation, they overran, Afghan civilians in a panic, fearful of what the Taliban were going to do to them, overran the airport. Some of them were able to get onto evacuation planes that they were not on a manifest, but they just pushed their way on. So a certain number, without any vetting or confirmation of who they were or whether they belonged leaving, were able to get out. And then there were a number of them, I'm sure all remember, who clung to the fuselage of these giant transport aircraft. And of course, they couldn't hang on, and they fell to their death taking off from the airport. The visuals of it were horrific. But with help from the Taliban, I would add, we were able to clear the airport and establish a perimeter. And basically, we had the security inside the airport, and the Taliban were trying to establish some degree of security outside the airport, where there were thousands of people trying to get in, many of them absolutely deserving to, and people we wanted to take out, and huge numbers of them having no claim at all, just out of fear, hoping that this was going to be their chance to escape. So we went from a very chaotic first few days to a very, very difficult couple of weeks, but not as chaotic in Afghanistan. But there were a lot of questions that had to be answered with not really a very clear advanced plan, because this was something we were going to do over a longer period of time in a safe and stable environment, not in a very short period of time in a very dangerous security environment. And so the teams that worked on this were working in a very difficult situation. And honestly, I'm biased, I candidly admit it, but I think they did a magnificent job given the constraints that they were faced with. Over those 2 weeks, or slightly more than 2 weeks, we evacuated 125,000 people out of that airport, which is the most we've ever done in a period that quickly. And we were working with our allies and partners who also had people that were in their embassies and in their military serving there who needed to get out. But one of the questions that we faced was, well, who goes and who do we prioritize? Clearly, U.S. citizens were a top priority, and we made extraordinary efforts to contact all of the American citizens that we knew of in Afghanistan. If you read the articles, you realize that the United States does not, we're not an authoritarian country that keeps track of every one of our citizens. We have a registration process, but it's voluntary. So it doesn't mean that we ever know for certain at any given moment how many Americans are in any particular country. But we made strenuous efforts around the clock, calling people, calling numbers that we knew of, or asking people if they knew of family or friends or relatives that were there. And we very cleverly farmed out that effort around the world. So consular sections in China were calling Afghanistan, trying to find people. And in most cases, I would say really all of the American citizens that we identified that were wanting to leave under the conditions that we were allowing were able to leave. Now, that does not mean all American citizens left. They did not. And we had a number of families that said, say the husband was American citizen, his parents and his aunts and his uncles, all his near relatives were all Afghan citizens. And maybe his wife was an Afghan. But what we would say is, if you're an American citizen, we will evacuate you and your immediate family. But the immediate family was not an Afghan definition, it was an American definition. So we mean you and your spouse and your children. And so there are a number of Americans of Afghan origin who said, no, my grandfather is part of my immediate family. My great aunt, I can't leave her behind. She is part of my immediate family. So there were a number of American citizens who chose to stay behind. Even though they wanted to leave, they were not willing to do so without a much larger extended family with them. So that's one of the things that at the time and subsequently there was a lot of misinformation about. But in fact, we really did get out everybody who was willing to go. And Subsequently, I haven't been involved in it subsequently, but I know that we have continued to try to get out those who subsequently decided that they wanted to leave if we possibly could. But that was one very difficult question. The other one was, well, who else? And the initial effort was to bring out Afghans that we felt were at risk. And that lasted for a day or two. And then we said, wait a minute, we need to have an order of priority. We certainly want to bring out Afghans who are at risk. Absolutely, we do. But we have 2 weeks here to get out as many people as possible. Do we want to leave behind our local staff, the people who actually worked at the embassy for the United States government, have them be left behind? And so we reprioritized, not denying the Afghans at risk by any means, but to say, okay, American official government employees would have the top priority. American citizens would have the second priority. Afghans who work directly for the American government would have a third priority. And then Afghans at risk would have a fourth priority. And we brought out all of the American official Americans. We brought out all of the American citizens who were able to make that decision. As I said, a few didn't. We were able to bring out almost all of the local embassy staff who worked at the embassy. And we brought out thousands of Afghans at risk. But did we bring out every Afghan at risk? Did we bring out every Afghan who had been involved in programs that we had sponsored that were carrying out, gender equality efforts, democratization efforts, civil society efforts? No, we did not. Could we have? Given the constraints we had, no, we could not. There just is no possible way every single Afghan who had some connection to the United States could have been brought out. And of course, we were criticized enormously for that. But I think under the circumstances, quite unfairly. It's not that it's not tragic that people were left behind, and some of those people have been killed. Others have been able to be brought out subsequently or have been able to escape subsequently. But there just was not a possible realistic way to bring out everybody. So that was one thing. The other thing that was a problem, and if you read the very critical piece by Kelly Curry and Amy Mitchell, they highlight it. There were a lot of efforts, private efforts, to bring out Afghans. And these efforts sort of went on two lines. One line was they would call me, or they would call somebody they knew at the embassy, or somebody they knew in Kabul, or somebody they knew on the task force staff. And they would say, you've got to bring out Abdul. He cleaned my house faithfully, diligently for months. He's a great guy, and he's going to be killed because he worked for me. And you would have to honor and respect the concern and the sorrow and the anguish of the person making that request. And I gave a sort of a silly example, but believe me, we had those. But there are others like, this person, she probably should win a Nobel Prize for what she did. You have to bring her out. She's a judge, right? So there are very, that whole range of people begging us to help to bring people out. But every minute that we're on the phone talking to somebody and trying to work through this, maybe 10 people that we could have brought out aren't, because we're distracted and working on trying to help this person who's not focused on everyone in Afghanistan. They're focused on the one person that they know and love and are worried about. And that's human nature. I mean, I fully understand, if somebody has given you loyal service and you think they're in grave danger, you want to help them. But in fact, in trying to help them, they were hurting hundreds of other people. By not sort of allowing us to do this job with the urgency that we required. And then the other effort were private efforts to go in and pull out Afghans. That one's a little trickier, and we received enormous criticism for that. Why didn't you let those private efforts take place? But there was no real organization or, structure to it. And some of them were very well done and very, or seem to be, of course, I don't know, but some of them seem to be very well done and very well organized, but others were just crazy cowboy operations that were going to get people killed trying to save other people. Or even in at least one case, an organization that seemed to be sensing an ability to profit from people's anguish and fear to cash in on getting paid to go in and rescue people. So it was very, very chaotic. And the idea that we would just sort of throw open doors and say, look, go in and get what you can, do whatever you can, we don't care, whatever, would have been highly irresponsible. And as I said, people would have gotten killed, and we would have frankly gotten blamed for that. But so it was, again, the stress and the chaos of that time is hard to overestimate. But certainly we were very criticized by the people who wanted to undertake those efforts. Let me see if there's a few other things I want to talk. I do want to leave a little time for questions and so forth. So the only other thing I guess I'd want to talk about, I mean, the task force was itself pretty amazing. We brought in people from all over the government, and many of them were quite junior. It was very stressful for them. I would have to go into the task force, periodically and just say, look, you're doing a great job. I know it's hard trying to support them and secure their morale. And certainly one of the worst days that I remember, was the August 26th. And so on that date, we had been getting numerous intelligence reports about issues pertaining to the security coming in. And it was very clear, I mean, that the Taliban were trying to help us because they wanted us to leave. And so they were trying to make it, to the extent as possible, not too difficult so that we would actually leave. And they were in tremendous conflict with a terrorist organization called ISIS Khorasan, the Islamic State in Khorasan province, which was even more radical than the Taliban. And so we understood they were trying to disrupt the evacuation. And on that date, a suicide bomber was able to get through the lines and set off his suicide bomb not too far away from Abbey Gate. And I vividly remember that night, which was, the time difference, the one I didn't figure out for this meeting. The time difference was such that late at night, it was early morning there, and we had a daily conversation with the head of the consular section. And he was an amazingly positive, upbeat person. Every day we talked to him, he'd tell us what we're doing in a very, very positive, upbeat fashion. And on that day, he was sobbing uncontrollably, because the 13 American soldiers, 11 Marines and 2 other soldiers who had been killed in that suicide bombing, they were friends. I mean, they were all working together under this very stressful circumstance, living together, eating together, working together. And so, it was like, his buddy. I mean, people think of that separation between the military and civilians, and often that exists, but it didn't exist there. They were all in it together. And he told us, he said, the timing of that bombing could have been very different. If it had been an hour later, no Americans would have died, because the team that was on the wall there at Abbey Gate were going to be leaving in less than an hour, and there would have been no Americans on the wall. So an hour later, there would have been no American casualties. An hour earlier, there would have been many, many, many more American casualties, including a lot of American Foreign Service officers who had been out there working with the Marines at Abbey Gate. And so the timing, as horrible as it was, I mean, 170 Afghans died. Let's not, it's not only Americans who suffered from this terrible bombing, but from that perspective, it could have been much worse. And even one American soldier dying is a tragedy. There's absolutely no doubt that every single human life is valuable, and the loss of it is a tragedy. But when you read some of the criticism, the political criticism of the evacuation surrounding the loss of those 13 soldiers, let's remember that those 13 represented less than 1/2, or maybe a little more than 1/2 of 1% of the total casualties of Americans in the Afghan war. So the other 2,400 casualties should receive our sorrow and our condolences every bit as much as those 13. But you sometimes read about it, it sounds like only 13 Americans died in Afghanistan, and that is far, far from being true. Very quickly, because we're almost out of time if we're going to have questions, the process that we set up and oversaw in such a short time was, frankly, logistically amazing. And so what did we have to do? If someone was going to come out, we had to identify them, we had to find them, we had to bring them to a location to arrange for them to be able to come through the gate. We had to get them through the gate, through hordes of people who are also trying to get in. We had to get them into the airport. Then we had to check them, vet them, see who they were, get them on a plane and fly them to a lily pad. And we had a number of lily pads. These were the airports outside of Afghanistan, but not too far away, because in order to move people, that many people that quickly, we needed short hops so that the big planes could go, come back, go, come back, go, come back. If they had to fly all the way back to the States, that's hours and hours and hours back and hours and hours and hours forth. We wouldn't have been able to pull out so many people. So this is an efficient way to move people in and out quickly. The lily pads started to get more and more full. Some of them had reasonable facilities and it wasn't too bad. Others were kind of horrific. People were dehydrated. They weren't getting enough food. And so we were having to try to arrange for food, arrange for shelter on a moment's notice in another country that was always very clear, this is a lily pad, they're not staying here, they got to go. And then the next step was, after some period of time, shorter or longer, and at a security vetting, they had to then be flown to the United States. And at the Dulles, we had a huge operation at the Dulles Expo Center, where the incoming Afghans were received, were processed, were identified, and then they went to kind of a new kind of a lily pad, which is the military bases around the country, where they were housed, fed, their medical attention was given to them. And we had issues like a measles outbreak. And of course, this was in the middle of COVID as well. So they would get vaccinated and so on. And then the final step would be from these military bases to some town in America. And I've always said, and I believe to this day, that the true test of the Afghan evacuation really will come down in 20 years, when the Afghans who we brought to the United States are either strong, self-sufficient American citizens contributing to our society and making us a better and a stronger place for their presence, or if they will be alienated or shunned or discriminated against, and in which case we will have failed them. And so the true test of what we did will really be measured 20 years from now, both in Afghanistan and in the United States. And so with that, I'm believing still, fortunately, at least 10 minutes for questions and comments, and I'm happy to welcome them. Thank you.
Thank you so much, George. That was fascinating. Let's see what's in the chat. I don't see anything there yet. Does anyone have any questions? Well, I would like to comment that must have been some vetting process, and you didn't have much time to do it, just to make sure you knew who was coming in. And
So Sheila, let me give one anecdote about that, which I had intended to, but because of time, I didn't. What was the biggest mistake that I made during those 17 days? I came on duty one night, and we were just starting to bring people from the lily pads to the Dulles Expo Center. And I was told that, there was a vetting process, but there were multiple agencies that had to vet the people who were coming in. And I was told that there had been a flight coming to the United States that they had found after they had already taken off. Someone on that flight had what we called pop red, meant somebody had identified a person who was of concern. I don't know what the concern is, but they had some concern, and the order had been given at the highest levels to turn that plane around and send it back because of that person who was on the flight. Well, I personally thought that was a kind of a misguided decision. You have the amount of resources and fuel and time and cost for one person. Why not bring them to the United States, let everybody off except that one person, and turn the plane around with that person on board and fly that back? That, to me, seemed to make more sense. Now, whether there were legal issues, I don't know. But what happened was, as I was working in the middle of the night, at like 2 a.m, that same thing happened again that night. And I had a conflict. Do I call, an assistant secretary or an undersecretary of state, actually it was the undersecretary of state, and confirm that I'm supposed to turn this plane around? Or do I adhere to precedent, since it's what they already did once during that day, and order that plane to be turned around? So I made a mistake, and I didn't wake up the undersecretary, and I turned the plane around. And at some point a little later, somebody else called and woke up the undersecretary. The undersecretary called me up and says, "No, don't turn it around, let it go." So we let it go. So my mistake, I should have gone ahead at 3 a.m. or 2 a.m. and woken up the undersecretary and confirmed that, knowing how exhausted they were, because they were working, around the clock as well. I chose not to. But it was a much better decision. I fully agreed with the decision not to turn it around because it just didn't make sense. But Sheila, that's to your point about the vetting. The vetting was very difficult, very complicated, multiple agencies with a very short timeline. So it wasn't that hard to imagine that, 3 out of 4 agencies would say green light, go. And then an hour or two later, when the plane's already in midair, the 4th agency comes in and says, we got this name. And, so it was so a good point that you make. Now I got a question from Marianne Hughes. Heroic efforts, what was the main reason we're not evacuated before? So two things, Marianne. The U.S. staff were evacuated, all right? So that is the vast majority of the U.S. staff were evacuated well before, but you needed the people there to, first of all, you need U.S. security personnel, because it was not just the military providing security, the diplomatic security was there present. And then you also needed the consular personnel, because if we were going to continue processing SIVs to get people out other than Americans, or other than official Americans, because even to process the U.S. citizens that were not official Americans, you needed consular personnel there. So the vast majority of the people who stayed were either security or consular. I won't say 100%, but a very, very large proportion. And most of the others had been evacuated before the chaos. And then the question about the military equipment. Yeah, I mean, military equipment is big, heavy stuff. And so there be 2 categories, I would say, or 3 categories. One would be stuff that was not, had outlived its useful life. It was broken down or damaged or something. Leave that behind. The other were items that, we had spent enormous funds in training the Afghan military. So leaving behind a significant amount of equipment for the Afghan military that ostensibly was going to fight the Taliban. In the end, They didn't, but we thought they would. That made sense. And then the third thing is, with that emergency and that timeline, do you bring out, armored personnel carriers, or do you bring out human beings at life or death risk? And it was an easy decision to bring out the human beings. In the end, at the airport, there was a certain amount of equipment left behind, and the stuff that would be potentially really useful to the Taliban, I think mostly we disabled it before we left. But that was the question on that.
I have a bunch of questions rolling in.
Yeah, now they're coming in, aren't they? All right. Did ISIS in Khorasan, not Corazon, which is the Spanish for heart, but Khorasan, which is a province, work with the Taliban? No, they were, and to this day remain opponents of each other. They're rival groups, and ISIS in Khorasan thinks that the Taliban are too gentle and kind and benevolent. So they're even worse. The Taliban were very much trying to prevent that bombing, but a random civilian person with a coat on, you don't know what's under their coat, and in his case, there was a bomb. One in light of the current Middle East crisis on the quality of our intelligence. Yeah, I mean, Mark, the question of the quality of intelligence, that's, it's very hard to say. I mean, you'll recall there was an attack against the CIA trainers by the people that the CIA was training that had been infiltrated and killed a number of the CIA trainers. I don't know if you remember that incident, but so it's certainly, in any intelligence operation, it's, you're trying to gain the advantage on the enemy, and the enemy's trying to gain the advantage on you. And certainly there are notable successes and terrible failures. And much of that occurs in the darkness that you will never hear about, and I will never hear about, because it's, those intelligence efforts are largely secret. Clearly in the current Middle East, the fact that the vaunted Israeli intelligence did not pick up on a massive attack across from Gaza astonishes me. Absolutely astonishes me. But what can improve it? You get up the next day and keep trying, and maybe there are different tactics and different techniques you can use, but mostly you just have to keep at it. Were the Afghans who reached the U.S. connected any organization that would help them with resettlement? Yeah, some of them were, and others were not. And besides that, there are resettlement agencies in the United States that, by the way, were largely overwhelmed by this huge number that came in suddenly. And I know of some instances, for example, in North Carolina, where I went back to North Carolina. My cousin was working with an organization trying to bring a family, and expressed enormous frustration with the hurdles and the bureaucratic obstacles to resettling them in Chapel Hill. Eventually they succeeded, but it was difficult. Does the State Department track all brought to the U.S. now and in the future as they're all over the country? Track, I mean, that's a difficult question. We have a free and open society, and so in China, I imagine they do a very good job of tracking the Uyghurs wherever they are and whatever they do. We obviously have a security apparatus that does try to keep track of people, but could I tell you, Tammy, that I think every single Afghan who came into the United States in the evacuation, we know exactly where they are and what they're doing at every moment of the day or night? We don't, and I'm glad we don't. I mean, I don't want to live in a society where that's the case, even though not having that information may present some risks. Other questions?
And if you'd like to raise your hand using the Zoom function, or just unmute yourself and ask a question, that is fine as well. All right, well, it's been a pleasure talking to you all, and I apologize again for the late start. But if any of you wants to contact me separately, feel free to send me an email. I'll put my email address in the chat. And
I wish you well, and I hope for all of us a more peaceful and stable world in the future, because we're certainly going through a very, very rough time right now.
We certainly are. I want to thank you so very much, George, for making the time for us and for all of your hard work. And I see someone has taken the words out of my mouth, a difficult job well performed. Thank you, sir. Yes, I think under terrible, extenuating circumstances, you served our country very well, and we're very grateful to you for what you did. Thank you, and you served with honor for our country. I appreciate it. It shows we do care about human beings, and we do what we can to protect them at all costs. So thank you. And thank you for making time for us and enlightening our lives and sharing this amazing experience that you had, and we're grateful to you. Thank you all for joining us. We appreciate it. And everybody enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Sheila, for your kind words.
Thank you, George. Appreciate it.